Thing
Yeah.
number three, Gary, we're talking about politicians now. You're hearing suggestions about price control. You're talking about shortages, asset confiscation, unrealized capital gains taxes for the ultra wealthy. Thing number three, Gary, tell us more about it. An economic plan to create Venezuela, part two.
Yeah,
Strong.
so we're in the political silly season right now. And first of all, let's just be clear. Um, Almost everybody in Washington, D.C., both parties, is economically illiterate. These people do not know how an economy works. They don't know how a budget works. They can't figure out value, and that is a bipartisan problem. Um, that said, we're sort of in this nutty, silly season where political candidates just sort of throw out these ideas. And, because, one candidate is generally speaks off the cuff and, will make it up as he goes along. And the other one is refusing to do any interviews and won't answer questions on anything or face, even fawning reporters. Nobody actually has to provide detail. In this case, we're looking at a really dangerous potential precedent here. One of the ideas being kicked around is taxing unrealized gains. And, I get it. I understand. It's very easy to say, yeah, but, it's only wealthy people who have, unrealized gains and, we should get them. And, other people will say, well, that policy only applies to people who have a net worth exceeding $100 million and who cares about those people, and we should just grab their wealth and redistribute it. Okay, let's talk about the implications of that. We're going to go back to the 1960s, and we ended up with a policy um, basically to capture value from just a dozen or so ultra wealthy families, right? And so that tax grab, they said to people, don't worry, we're just going after the money of like a dozen or so ultra wealthy families. And a few decades later, that same tax policy was grabbing money from millions of middle class Americans. And that is always what happens. They always promise you, don't worry, we're only going to go after the ultra wealthy. And then it's, well, the wealthy, well, these people, well, and guess what? The ultra wealthy don't have enough money. If you think it's just going to be them, you're foolish. They are coming after you. If you are listening to this, they are coming after you. That asset confiscation will not be limited to people who have a net worth of $100 million. And even if you're thinking, okay, fine, cut it 100 times. My net worth isn't $1 million. I'm safe. You're not safe. I assure you, they are coming for every one of you. They didn't hire 80,000 new IRS agents so that they could go after, the few hundred or few thousand families with a net worth of over $100 million. They don't need 80,000 IRS agents to go after people who have a 9-figure net worth. They are coming for you. So let's talk about what would happen in these policies. Let's imagine for a minute that you own 1,000 shares of your favorite stock. It could be something like GameStop, right? You guys love GameStop, right? So maybe you own 1,000 shares of GameStop. And, Roaring Kitty comes out and he says, hey, everyone, I think GameStop's going to be up. It's going to be up huge. We're all in great shape. But you already own your 1,000 shares and that stock goes to the moon, right? That's the expression. And all of a sudden you're sitting on huge gains. And that's terrific. You don't have cash. You have that 1,000 shares in your brokerage account. And then you get to year end or April 15th. And the government says, well, you're sitting on a lot of gains in GameStop. Why don't you pay us? The only thing is your money's invested and you don't have the cash from GameStop. You're holding this, right? You're holding it and you're going to hold it until that stock goes to the moon. Well, guess what? There's only one way you're going to be able to pay the government bill. You have to start selling your GameStop stock and then hand over the proceeds to the government. And so in this hypothetical example, maybe you go into the next year and you own 700 or 800 shares. Now, you don't have any cash in your pocket. You've just handed the government the proceeds from your shares. And then, Roaring Kitty comes out and says something else and GameStop goes up again. Well, guess what? The next year, you're going to have to sell more of that stock to pay the government bill. And now maybe you have 500 or 600 shares in your account. You don't have any more cash. You've just been paying the government on unrealized gains. Now, if this sounds like asset seizure, that's because it is asset seizure. This is 100% wrong, making people who haven't realized gains pay taxes on these unrealized gains. And by the way, Rob, here's where it gets even worse, because it does get even worse. Stocks like GameStop have been volatile. So what if, the stock goes up and your 1,000 shares is worth a lot of money and you've got to sell a bunch of shares. And now, say you have 700 shares in your account because you had to sell 300 shares to pay the government. Now, let's say things don't go well, right? GameStop has been volatile and, they shut off the buy button or something else again. And the price of GameStop stock comes down. Is the government going to send you your stock back? Are they going to refund you? Right? No. What you have then is an unrealized capital loss. Now, I have no idea what the tax treatment of unrealized capital losses will be, or if they're even thinking of giving you a credit for it. But I can tell you with realized losses, if you don't recognize that loss in the year that it's taken and they separate your losses into long-term and short-term, so you might have short-term losses and long-term gains, guess what? You pay capital gains taxes on your long-term gains, but those short-term losses get carried forward. And you're like, okay, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is you can only apply about $3,000 of that in each year. And so, good luck getting your money back. You can be in a situation where you have to sell your stock in order to pay the government, but then you could take a loss on it later. Is the government going to send your stock back? Are they going to send your money back? Don't count on it. I wouldn't bet on that. So, one, it's not just the ultra wealthy. If you're listening to this, they're coming for you. Two, this is asset confiscation, and you can easily end up in a situation where you're handing the government gains on cash that you don't have. You have a smaller position, and then you could potentially have unrealized losses. They're not going to pay you for that. Rob, this is a disaster. It is theft.
Gary, with the price control measures, there's talk about it being aimed at preventing, perceived price gouging as well. I think this is where you're going to get into the Venezuela piece of the conversation.
Yeah. So one of the things that people don't like, and I understand why they don't like it, is when we have shortages and prices go up, people say, oh, this is bad. People are, they're profiteering, they're making money off of an emergency. This should be illegal. And the problem is every time people try to implement price controls, you end up with shortages. Without an incentive to produce, people won't produce, and you end up with shortages. Without an incentive to stock merchandise where they could be losing money, retailers won't stock that merchandise. And so you just end up with shortages. Now, we saw this in Venezuela where they had horrible inflation. Sound familiar? Then they started talking about price controls. Sound familiar? And they did it on food. Sound familiar? Because right now politicians are talking about taxing excess gains and trying on food. And I want to get to how crazy that is in a minute. But Venezuela did exactly that. And guess what, Rob? They ended up with a starvation situation. Venezuelans couldn't get enough food. And the few Venezuelans who could get food, because they didn't want to sell that food at the discounted official price, even though Venezuela was starving, they shipped the food out. They sent it to neighboring countries where they could get full price for it. This is just a disaster. You end up with this disaster everywhere all the time. And food in particular is a dangerous way to do this. Lynn Alden put out a great chart on this, showing Kroger profit margins. And, if we go back about 10 years ago, their profit margins were about where they are right now, which is about 1.4%. So first, let's talk about how little 1.4% is. Imagine for a minute that somebody goes into a supermarket and they say, wow, everything's really expensive. And by the way, things are expensive. I saw an $8 gallon of milk the other day, which is shocking, right? An $8 gallon of milk. But say somebody says, wow, this is just too expensive. I can't afford this. They steal a $10 item. And let's not even criticize that person. Let's just say, okay, we understand that what they did was wrong, but they were hungry. Okay, I got it. They steal a $10 item. Rob, with Kroger's 1.4% profit margin, that means the supermarket has to sell $700 of groceries to make up for that one theft. And so people are saying these companies are price gouging. They're not price gouging. Their margins haven't gone up. Their margins have been roughly stable. They've actually come down since COVID started. The fact is the price of food is going up. And part of that is because the current administration is waging a war on energy. And you would not believe how much energy, and diesel fuel in particular, that's required to farm. And we have all of these water use regulations. Okay, I get it. Nobody wants to be, in a situation where we have a polluted water supply. Understood. But all of these regulations that we have in the United States are making food more expensive. And we've done some really unwise things in terms of killing chickens who were healthy, but one of the chickens in the flock had come down with a virus, and we've just done everything with a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel. And so we do have higher food prices, but the retailers aren't gouging. So everyone who thinks, hey, I don't like my grocery bill, we can force Kroger or Safeway or Albertsons to sell to us at a discount. That's not what's going to happen. These companies have a 1.4% profit margin. And so here's what's going to happen. The government's going to say, you can't sell item X for more than this price. And if that is below the cost that the supermarket has, they won't carry that item. So you're going to end up in a situation where not where you get all the food you want at the price you want. You're going to end up in a situation where you have empty supermarket shelves. And the only thing worse than paying a lot for groceries is not being able to find groceries. This is Rob, we talk a lot, and I'm passionate about this because this is a disaster. We talk a lot about the bad economic decisions made in Washington and the toll it's taking on the American people. And we discuss that a lot. This policy leads to a humanitarian disaster. This policy leads to hungry people. And you know what? The thing that's worse than inflation is not having enough to eat. This is a disaster.
Gary, the profit margin, right? Everyone on the other side of the aisle, they at least, or a few I've had conversations with, will come back with, seems like quite often, but the CEO of Kroger makes X amount, right? And these executives make X amount. How do you bridge that gap with someone that's using that as their rationale and argument for these companies are price gouging, even though based on that 1.43% profit margin, they clearly are not?
Yeah. So, if so, I don't actually know how much the CEO of Kroger makes, nor do I know off the top of my head, what Kroger's revenue was. And we'd have to compare it. But what I can tell you is even if we cut the pay of Kroger's CEO by 90%, it's not going to change the price of milk and eggs. It's not enough in the grand scheme of things. And, if you want to argue that these executives are overpaid, hey, fair enough. That's great. But the issue with being the CEO of a company is theoretically, you have to face your shareholders. You have to be able to deliver value. And a CEO who can deliver a lot of shareholder value, and by the way, the best way to deliver shareholder value is to produce a great product at a good price or sell good products at a great price, right? I mean, whatever your retail strategy is, the only way you're going to be able to create shareholder value is by creating value for your customers and by creating a good shopping experience for your customers. And by experience, we could talk about the quality of products you have, the variety of products you have, the ability to source rare products, and price. That is part of it. And so this all gets wrapped up in one thing. But the truth is, a CEO can create a lot of shareholder value by creating value for their customers is worth what they get paid. And firing that person and hiring somebody at half that price, you could do that, but it could still make things worse. But either way, the CEO of Kroger is not making enough money where we can cut his pay and you're going to get milk and eggs at a better price. It just doesn't work that way. Rob, I understand the value of that argument because it's emotional.
Mhm.
right? It says, hey, there are rich people involved here and there are poor people who are trying to buy food and therefore they're connected.
Right.
Except they're not connected and the word therefore needs to be taken out of the sentence and it just doesn't work that way. And so I understand, the attractiveness of making an emotional argument. We don't do that here at Deep Knowledge Investing. I understand there are people who will like what we say and people who won't like what we say and people who agree or disagree. But, we need to deal with this stuff in a rational world. We don't believe in making emotional arguments. And I think those arguments they're cheap. I understand it's a huge problem when people can't afford food. The answer to that is cut spending in Washington. That will reduce inflation. The answer to that is cut regulations in Washington. Give our small farmers the
Yep.
ability to farm without so much government oversight and without so much government expense of dealing with government regulations. And we'll end up with a less expensive lives and less expensive food. One of the issues we have, our currency is being debased. And that's just a fancy way of saying the purchasing power of your dollar is going down. Cut spending in Washington. That will fix it. Fixating on, the compensation of a few wealthy employees. I get that sounds really good in front of a TV camera. It's good if you want to rile up a crowd. But if you want to deal with how things really work and fix the problem, that doesn't fix anything. That's just a cheap way to win applause lines from people who don't understand economics.
Moving to the Fed, Gary. Fed's going to cut. We have that coming up in September. Inflation is not defeated. And so predictably,